First we need the... Are you actually rolling?
Yeah.
And this is okay? The mic is not rustling or anything for me?
No, it sounds fine.
Good.
And you've heard enough from both of us.
We both heard it.
He has a real voice. I have one of these foggy things. My name is Ellen Taaffe Zwilich. I'm here today with Ara Guzelimian, who's the artistic advisor at Carnegie Hall. Hello, Ara.
Hello, Ellen.
It is April the 16th, 1999, and I'm close to the very end of a 4-year tenure as the first Carnegie Hall Composer's Chair. We're here today in the archives of Carnegie Hall in another of the series of composer archival videotapes. So,
Ellen, let's begin with a recent honor, and then we'll look back and come back to the present day. Musical America, in its current edition, 1999, has chosen you to be the Composer of the Year, which is a wonderful recognition of one's place in the musical life of this country in a very broad context. And it's one of a series of happy congratulatory phone calls that have come to you, and we'll go backwards to some of them. But talk about how you found out about this one and what this particular honor means, especially in the company of some of the other musicians who are honored as well. Andre Previn, who's the Musician of the Year, and some of the others.
And Manny Axe and the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center. Right. Well, it was a great honor for me, of course, and I was jumping for joy when they called me and told me I was Composer of the Year for 1999, and they did a very nice sort of project where they showed a lot of sort of the history of me as a composer, and it's a very nice thing to be a part of, I think. I think probably being a composer and being able to compose is the greatest honor of all, and that to me, I mean, of course, it's wonderful to be also recognized by your peers, and I think that's something very special for us.
Talk a little about the fact that composing itself is a solitary occupation, the act of composing. Obviously, once the work is written, then a series of collaborations begin, and how recognition and acceptance, especially by one's peers, can help feed the creative process for a composer, to know that one's peers, especially one's fellow musicians, and the company we're in this sort of award, can give one an additional degree of confidence, or the fact that one's work is recognized when it begins in a solitary room with you and a blank page of music paper.
Well, that's, to me, probably the most interesting thing about what I do to people who don't do it is the extremes. For instance, I spend most of my time, as you said, alone in a room with a blank piece of paper. And yet, even while I'm sitting there, I'm thinking of the performers. I'm imagining them playing my music. And I do everything in that moment, including having score paper of the whole ensemble that I'm using to sketch. So I have a sense of the presence of the ensemble I'm writing for. But it's a very, very solitary kind of inward-looking existence. And then, boom, it's like you're shot out of a cannon, and you suddenly meet 106 new orchestra people and an audience of 2,500 each night. And it's just an incredibly varied experience. And I think both things are necessary. In fact, I think of it almost like, the Northern European thing where you take sauna and you get very hot and then you jump into cold ice water and then back, and I think it keeps your arteries open somehow or other. But for me, the feedback with performers, and as I've looked over the materials that are just here at Carnegie Hall, I see how much is an ongoing relationship, and this means the world to me. When I see, for instance, the relationships that I have that go back 25 years with performers, you just have to have a reaction to that and a feeling of fulfillment and of learning from one another and growing together, and it's a very special kind of thing.
So the extreme of a composer's life goes from the very private to sometimes
to the
very
extraordinarily public, yes.
And that moment of stepping out on stage here at Carnegie Hall for you very often in recent years. When did...
That's a moment of great joy. That's the whole thing, not just the stepping on the stage, but when you sit in an auditorium with 2,500 other people and hear your music, or I should say, I'm the only composer that knows how I feel. When I sit there and you're hearing a piece with all these other people for the first time, and the performers are reacting to the audience for the first time, so you really are hearing the first performance of the piece as opposed to a rehearsal. That is just an experience it's just hard to imagine, and it's I kind of feel like a huge gong that's been hit, and it takes me a few days to oscillate down to like normal. It's a wonderful experience.
We've just gone through this young composers process. One of the things that struck me at the workshop just a few days ago, we had the rare chance to hear pieces develop over rehearsal, very often by expert performers, and then finally the blossoming of the pieces at a performance at the Weil Recital Hall. I was very much struck by, no matter how good the rehearsals were, that the performance still had yet another degree of edge and communicative power. Maybe it's the tension in both its positive and negative manifestations, that the pieces finally had a kind of sheen in performance that even in the best rehearsal they never quite had, which isn't to suggest that some of the rehearsals may have gone more mechanically perfectly. Do you find that true?
Definitely,
in the experiences?
and I have a very simple explanation for it. When you're in rehearsal, you are working. And when the composer's in the room, the performer is looking over his or her shoulder. As a matter of fact, when Lauren Mazel recorded my bassoon concerto with Nancy Garris, and I was invited to the recording session, I said, no, I don't want to be in that room. It's between you and the audience. It's your piece now, it's not my piece. I said the same thing to the Chamber Music Society when they recorded my clarinet quintet. I went to the rehearsal. I know all the people very well. I knew they'd do it great, but it has to be theirs. And when you're looking over your shoulder, you're not projecting in the same way as if you're out there and it all rises or falls on your shoulders. So I think it's a very human kind of situation that. My feeling about writing music is I write it and then I turn it over to what I hope are very good hands. There's usually a collaboration process in preparing a performance, but once you get to that point where you're ready for the public, and you should, in my opinion, should never play if you're not. And we did everything we could in this workshop to make sure that it was ready to go. Once you're there, then it's the communication is very direct between the performer and the audience, and the composer is kind of incidental to the process in a wonderful kind of way.
I think that's very smart, what you do, particularly in a recording session. I'd never really thought about that. Good for you, that you you let the piece go. Obviously, in the examples you gave with Chamber Music Society and the Pittsburgh Symphony, you had worked closely with them individually and in rehearsal and through the first performance. But that by your absence, you give both a vote of confidence and a certain measure of freedom. I think that's so smart. We are talking in April of 1999, in a month that sees a milestone birthday for you, and I would say safely that you're one of the most honored composers in America, not only with the Musical America Composer of the Year, but a Pulitzer Prize to your credit, and this tenure as the founding Composers Chair of Carnegie Hall. I would think there was a time, if we can turn the clock back, when all of these honors were probably if not the furthest thing from your mind, at least your wildest fantasies, some of these honors. Talk about your early years. Give us a little sense of your family background, particularly in terms of involvement in music, and talk about first how you became involved in music, and then we'll take it the next step when composition became a part of your thought process.
Okay. First of all, I have to say that my wildest dreams were to have I used to just dream like the New York Philharmonic would play a piece of mine or something. I never dreamed about winning prizes and things like that. I didn't know to dream about it. It's very nice. But for me, the really fulfilling thing are the wonderful performances by artist performers. I was born almost 60 years ago in Miami, Florida. I was adopted by Ruth and Edward Taaffe when I was about 6 months old. My mother's name was Alice Virginia Hope. I found that out when I was 50 years old. And for any musicologist that would be looking through my works, you would find my flute concerto is dedicated to my beloved mother, Alice Virginia Hope, and my clarinet quintet is written in memory of my mother, Ruth Taaffe. My father, Edward Taaffe, was an airline pilot. He flew Clippers from Miami to Rio in the 30s. In fact, they lived in Rio for a couple of years in the 30s. And I lived mostly in Miami, although we moved to Jacksonville when I was quite young, because I know I was in Jacksonville when Pearl Harbor happened. And I was very young. I was a toddler. I guess I was a year and a half. But I knew from what happened to the adults that something terrible had happened, and I knew what a pearl was. So it just always stuck in my mind. I know I was playing with my toys in front of the radio when this happened. I grew up mainly in Florida. The family that I grew up in was not musical, but we did have a piano in the house. And before I could walk, I crawled up under the piano bench and found out what happened when you press down a key. And there's a part of me that's never left that piano bench. It's like a world that I can't believe exists, this world of music. And I used to sit at the piano and make things up, and I was the kind of little kid that had to be told to go out and play with your friends, stop doing this. I began to play other instruments as I got into about 6th grade, something like that. I began to play the trumpet and the violin. And by the time I was in high school, I was pretty good at both. I was concertmaster of the orchestra and first trumpet in the band. And we had a fabulous music program in Coral Gables. I went to Coral Gables High School in outside of Miami. Our symphonic band was almost on a professional level. The orchestra, could struggle and scraggle its way through the Mozart 40th Symphony. It was a very, very strong program. I do have a picture that goes back 40. It has to be 44 years. This is two of my colleagues, and this is me with the fiddle. Interestingly, this was a co-ed school, and these three were girls. She was first trombone, she was first clarinet, and I was the concert master, or as they said in those days, concert mistress. But we had behind-the-screen auditions in my high school, which is kind of hard to believe.
Way ahead of its time.
Yeah, and so you had, like in a normal, as we find today in orchestras, you had the girls got to the top over here and the boys got to the top over there, and nobody said boo about it, which was quite remarkable to me. But anyway, I had my first really inspiring teacher was a trumpet teacher. I had pretty awful experiences with music teachers in general until I got to him. I started studying piano when I was 5, and I liked the music I made up better than the music I was given, and said so, and wouldn't practice certain pieces that I was given for recital. I thought they were stupid, and I mean, I must have been impossible, but I had a violin teacher who we just couldn't get along at all. I had the wrong questions. And I didn't really get to a good teacher until I was about 12 or 13. Meanwhile, I had started kind of writing things down in a very childish scrawl, and I was still doing a lot of improvising on the piano and on whatever I had at hand.
That strikes me as very unusual, that you had the creative instinct, not only the recreative instinct of performing, but the desire to make it up, it sounds like, from the beginning.
Oh,
when you started writing it down, was anyone directing you, a teacher?
No.
So that desire goes back very early.
It's very, very early and unprompted, and probably related to my actual genetic family. But
Do you know much about your birth family?
I know about my mother's side, and it's funny, there are musicians everywhere. Someone sang in the San Francisco Opera, there were violinists, and there were also, I mean, my grandfather rode with Pancho Villa, and somebody else opened one of the first casinos in Nevada, and I mean, it was the kind of people that were just, kind of wild enough to want to write music. And I'm kind of glad I was left alone as a youngster, because I think if I'd found really good teachers, I probably would have been a pianist or violinist, solely. And I've had really good discipline that resulted in something. When you study an instrument and you work very hard and you hear the results, it's very inspiring. But I was left kind of alone, which I think was basically good. Also, I was interested in all kinds of music. It was not just the European piano teacher beating you over your knuckles, but I was playing in little bands and, doing all kinds of things.
So you listened to the pop music at the time as well. It wasn't.
Sure. And as a matter of fact, when I was in high school, one of the things that happened to me that might have spoiled me in a certain regard is that we used to, if you played in the symphonic band, you had to play in the marching band. And our football team, of course, played in the Orange Bowl, which is a pretty big place. And we had a band director who couldn't read a score and tell what it was going to sound like. And so 2 or 3 times it happened. We got out on the field on a Monday, and the game was on Saturday, and you couldn't hear the tune because it was in the celesta, which is back in the. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but he would scream, "Taaffe, go write us an arrangement." He would send kids that had demerits running behind me, and I would go in and quickly, do this.
And then would they copy the parts?
They copied the parts. I wrote as fast as I could. They copied the parts, and Saturday night it was in the Orange Bowl. I think one of the things was Bally High I did, and This Old House, or, you know, little things like that, kind of popish tunes at the time. Another one of my occupations in high school was taking the trumpet solos off the Glenn Miller recordings there was a little dance band, which I didn't play in at that time because I wanted to dance. And none of the trumpet players could improvise, so I would take the stuff off the recordings. And as I mentioned, this inspiring teacher, the trumpet teacher that I had, his name was Bear Murphy, and one of my pieces is dedicated to him because he was a Pied Piper kind of teacher. And if he thought you were just sort of hanging in there, he gave you easy stuff. If he thought you had talent, he pushed you incredibly. You know, I was the second week I studied with him, I was in a brass ensemble at the university, and I was a little 13-year-old girl. And the next time I went to the Miami Symphony, the whole brass section knew about me, and he was a really wonderful kind of teacher. And he had me bring my fiddle in and play, and he had me bring in some of my writing, and he himself wrote little two-part inventions that he played with his students and etudes for a certain problem you'd have. So it was. I was just kind of doing this and that and everything you could think of. I began to sort of write kind of quasi-serious things about my senior year in high school. But still, at that point, the only career I thought of was as a music teacher. Mm-hmm. And I went to Florida State as a music education major. I changed, I think, towards the end of my first year to theory and composition, against a lot of advice, because I had really discovered that I didn't want to be a music teacher. I wanted to make music. I also discovered in college, I went to Florida State University first. And Tallahassee was a very interesting place for a couple of reasons. One is that this was, of course, just after World War II, which meant a variety of things for a college student in those days. One, of course, was that the best people in Europe had left, and they were here. Ernst von Dohnanyi was at Florida State, and it isn't just that he was a name in the catalog. I had, if not daily, at least weekly contact with him. I played, and he had a conducting class and a little orchestra assembled for them to conduct the second half of the class. I did that for 3.5 years until he passed away. I played chamber music with him. He drove me home on Tuesdays. He knew who I was dating. It was a very wonderful thing, and we got to talk to him about music and get a totally different perspective. At that time, he was really so much a successor to Brahms that people didn't come there to study composition with him. They studied piano with him. When he taught composition, he taught fugue. Mm-hmm. So those of us who were composers were doing something that we were more interested in his contemporary Bartok. But I must say that was an extraordinary thing, and there was a wonderful faculty there. They still have an excellent faculty. And meanwhile, in the town of Tallahassee, it was kind of a jazz hotbed. This was the era of segregation. I was there during the sit-ins, the World War sit-ins that began the civil rights movement. But when I first went to Tallahassee, this was in 1956, Nat Adderley and Cannonball Adderley were local boys. And there was a kind of a hotbed of people who were interested in the jazz of the time. And the music building was closed every Sunday. The rehearsal room, rather, was locked, the big instrumental rehearsal room. But magically a whole bunch of people had keys, and it was an all-day long jam session. And it was a wonderful kind of jazz education with the older people kind of bringing along the younger ones and saying, hey, you got to go listen to this. And it was quite extraordinary.
And did you play in those?
Oh, I played. Yeah, I played trumpet.
So you kept both violin and trumpet going through college?
All the way through college, yeah. And I played, like when I was in high school, I played the Haydn Concerto on the trumpet. I was a pretty good trumpet player. And I could improvise, so I was useful in the lab band.
Mm-hmm.
And we had people writing arrangements and doing interesting big band stuff. But the small combo jazz just really went on all day Sunday, and that was very interesting to me. And although there were people in the faculty that frowned on that, and then there were people in the jazz community saying, you know, what are you doing with Beethoven? I had this peculiar American education that people of my generation managed to get, and that's where I would go from playing a Bartok string quartet to playing a Brahms piano trio to playing a trumpet and lab band. And none of this seemed peculiar. I mean, this just seemed like a normal thing. I still think it's a perfectly normal thing, but it's an American perspective, very uniquely American, I think.
How does it, to leap forward for a second, how does that combination of things in your background manifest itself? Can you see it in your music? Does it liberate you in any way? Does it prevent you from saying, oh, I can't do that? Because having a broader musical vocabulary, does it allow you to do things you couldn't do with a narrower background?
Oh, I think definitely. And it's odd. I don't think it's so much a matter of techniques, but it's a matter of feeling that you have the right, you might say, as a young composer, to choose your ancestors and to go towards those things that you most love. And I think that's why when I've done the Making Music series, it occurred to me to ask composers to bring other music that means something to you, because it's such a different experience from past experience and even present experience some places in the world, where it's true that we are, to a large extent, what we have loved as musicians, and we bring this whole thing to the mix. We're all very different.
I love that notion of, as a composer, you choose your ancestors. That's really wonderful. I'm curious, I want to know some of your specific musical ancestors. I'm always curious what pieces you early on fell in love with, almost as a kid or a teenager. What classical pieces do you remember particularly connecting to or having a fixation on that somehow drew you or that you responded to with particular strength?
Yes, and as a matter of fact, when I did my own Making Music concert, the music I brought is music that I love. It was Beethoven and George Gershwin and Thelonious Monk. I remember hearing the Beethoven Fifth Symphony and thinking it was just the most wonderful thing in the world. And I remember, I mean, this sounds really silly, but I was very little, and I when I found out that he was dead, I was just terribly sad. You know, it's like, this was, you know, it just was so full of life to me. And that music continues to just have an unbelievable resonance with me. I think I grew up in the Catholic Church, and in the days when they had chant. Now, Father Brennan may have had a pretty lousy voice, but the Gregorian chant is also an extraordinarily beautiful thing, and it's something that's sort of been with me my whole life.
And in what you've described so far, I'm also struck by the fact that you said in your last year of high school, you began to write your first sort of serious pieces. And by a little more than a year later, by the end of your first year in college, that you had focused on theory and composition, even though you were obviously very able as a violinist and trumpeter, you didn't focus on performance.
Well, that's not quite true, because I was kind of doing everything musical that wasn't nailed down, basically. I played in, I once was told by a faculty member that I knew rather well that the conductor of the orchestra was asked about somebody to play a particular thing, and he says, well, ask Taaffe, she'd rather play than eat, which was really probably true. I played, I just made music all day long. And in fact, one of the things that convinced me to be a professional musician was when a professor said, well, enjoy it while you can, because when you get out of school, you won't be able to be involved with performance that much. And I thought, oh, God, maybe, this is not what I want. Yeah. I want to be involved with performance.
But you still chose, with that level of activity, I'm interested in that, you still chose theory and composition, that on some level, some part of you was focusing on
I was most
composition.
I was most interested in that, but I guess it was the word focus, because I've often likened my life as a composer to taking a lens, and just sort of gradually bring it into, there, you got it.
So performing and composing just sounds like naturally have coexisted from the first instinct.
Yeah.
At some point, you focused your performance activities on violin rather than trumpet. Was that in college or after college?
Yeah, I began to, I had, by the time I was a senior in college, even though I wasn't a trumpet major, I'd played everything I wanted to play of the repertoire. I didn't have any particular interest in playing an orchestra. A couple of my boyfriends went on to, one of them went out to Las Vegas and became Frank Sinatra's favorite trumpet player. Another went to the Minnesota Orchestra, where he still is. I didn't have any interest in professional trumpet playing, and I had gotten kind of bored with the literature. In fact, I wrote a sonatina partly for that reason. Meanwhile, I got more and more interested in the violin literature, and particularly the chamber music literature. And that's when I already had a master's degree in composition when I decided to come to New York. And one of the reasons I came to New York was to audition for Guzelimian. But I would say that when I look back, I see, everything I did sort of leads clearly to something. But I was kind of muddling around. And of course, when you realize that around 1960, there was no such thing, even less than today, as profession composer. Mm-hmm. What is a composer going to do? Well, the ones I know taught.
What did you, as you emerged from college, what did you imagine your future to be?
I had no idea. I kind of, I tried college teaching, and I liked it. Okay, but it made me realize I wanted to write, and I wanted to be involved with, real hands-on music making. I don't want to be sitting in a classroom somewhere talking about it. I want to be doing it one way or the other. So fortunately, when I came to New York, I passed my audition with Guzelimian. I knew, I think, 2 people in New York at that time. I really had no support system of any sort, but I had a wonderful time, and
what year was this?
1963 or 4, I forget. And I kind of soon began to work as a violinist. And that was something that I just feel terribly grateful to have had the experience I had. I also have done a lot of teaching. I think the second year I was here, my violin teacher from Florida, Richard Bergen, was up here for the Metropolis competition. And he said, what are you doing? I was playing in the orchestra, and I said, well, I'm doing this, 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 and this. He laughed. He said, everybody in New York has 3 jobs. I was like a typical young freelance musician. I was doing a little teaching. I was doing a lot of playing, and at one point I wrote liner notes for, I just really kind of did whatever I had to do. But the second year I was here, I began to play full-time with the American Symphony under Leopold Stokowski, a picture of whom we have over here from that time. That's really... I think he knew the camera was on him at this moment.
I think he always assumed.
Oh, yes, the camera was always rolling for Stokowski. Here's another picture. That's very... It was interesting. His hands were so much a part of his conducting. His phrasing with the hands. And that was 7 years. Yesterday, I just went through the archive, and I didn't even get all the way through. There was just so much stuff. But I remember it for so many different reasons. Among them, Stokowski, for whatever his musical failings and pretenses and whatnot, he had a contemporary piece on just about every program we did, unless you were doing, a huge evening-long thing. There was a new piece. And as I look back through the programs that I played in, it reminds me that, we were playing Lutoslawski and Takemitsu in the 60s. The Ives Fourth premiere took place the year before I joined the orchestra. But I did play it with Stokowski like 2 or 3 years later. And as I won't repeat what I said to you. Among other things, in the American Symphony experience, we had not only Stokowski, who was... we were a young orchestra. We were a very young orchestra. In fact,
and he was a very old conductor.
He was in his upper 80s, and he had not slowed down in certain ways. But it was a very young orchestra, and a lot of people kind of went through there. For instance, Jerry Schwartz was there for a while as a trumpet player, and now, of course, he's a wonderful conductor. But one of the things I most remember about the orchestra was some of the guest conductors we had, and we have a couple of these pictures here. Eugen Joachim, who was with whom I recall a concert with the Bruckner Fifth Symphony. And Bruckner was not my cup of tea, but he made me love it. And that, to me, was a mark of a great conductor. We don't have a picture of Karl Böhm, but I think we have a program back there. He did an absolutely memorable concert, Schubert.
The great C major.
Yeah, and Hindemith Symphonic Metamorphoses. And a kind of interesting thing for me as a young performer and composer was going through this experience of dealing with people on that kind of a level. Now, Böhm, for instance, had very poor stick technique. And unlike Joachim, who was like a grandfatherly, no, that's not right, do it this way, and, patient teacher, Böhm's idea of rehearsing was announcing that he was going to go back to Vienna, where they really knew how to play, and just sort of screaming and kind of ineffectually. But Böhm got so much out of an orchestra, and played also at the Met. There's a picture of Karl Böhm. Also played with him at the Met. where he managed to somehow or other follow Strauss's dictum about making Salome a scherzo. I mean, he did it that way. But one of the things I was always trying to figure out was what is it that makes a really fine conductor? And my working conclusion is that it has to do with knowing the music, and that somehow or other a conductor with poor technique and an inability to rehearse well because of intense knowledge of a piece, somehow or other it crosses the stand. This is another conductor that worked with Ernest Ansermet, with whom I remember doing a Daphnis and Chloe suite, and to come into contact with this level of musician, and it goes on and on. A picture I wanted to come up with was Aaron Khachaturian, who conducted the orchestra in an entire Khachaturian concert. And I remember him so fondly as this big bear with big bushy black eyebrows, and his admonitions of how to play, where he didn't speak any English. And at that time, now it would be very different, but at that time there was no one in the orchestra who spoke Russian. And he had a translator who knew Russian extremely well and English extremely well, but didn't know music, so everything she said was funny. And so after about a half of a rehearsal, the manager finally had enough sense to dispense with her, and he, with no and yes and gestures and singing, we got along extremely well with Khachaturian. We also did whole concerts with Beria, with Henze. There's a wonderful Stokowski concert in there somewhere with a big piece by Earl Brown that Earl ended up conducting. There was a concert Matthias Bammert had written a piece for. Matthias is now a very well-known conductor. And I remember that very fondly because it had two violin solos, and I was one of them. But we had just like week after week, this kind of presence of some of the finest people, and how they came to music, how they approached it, how they worked. And of course, I do believe that there is no way for a composer to know to know how your music is going to sound. You need a tremendous amount of experience. There's just no substitute for it. I mean, particularly the synthesizers, because they don't have the weights and volumes of an orchestra. They don't have the quality, although they're getting awfully good. But certainly knowing what it feels like to play. There are certain things, for instance, I was always very conscientious, and I once left one of the only existing first violin parts to Ilya Muromets on the subway, which I never got back. But I took it home to work on it, For instance, with a contemporary piece, if I went home and woodshed something and really got to playing it well, and then you find yourself swamped in the orchestra where it wouldn't matter what you played at all, which happens, rather frequently with contemporary music. I would never do that to somebody. My music is hard. My music is much harder than it looks. But I want it to be rewarding, so that if you master it, then it sounds and it speaks. And it's been a persistent preoccupation of mine to let instruments speak. And much of the experience I had, I also played a lot of contemporary chamber music too. There are lots of pieces that are wonderful pieces, but instrumentally, they choke up an instrument, or they don't liberate it, they don't let it, as I say, speak. And that's been a persistent preoccupation of mine. I'm sure it comes out of that.
In my experience, there are times when an orchestra almost naturally regards a composer as an adversary, especially a composer that may demand awkward things or unflattering things from them as individual instrumentalists. So there's occasionally an us and them mentality between composer and orchestra. I would imagine it's impossible for you to have that, because once you've been one of them, that never quite leaves you, and the practical reality of performance can't be very far from the abstract process of writing for you.
Well, I'm always, when I'm writing, I'm hearing it, and I'm writing things that I hear. And when I'm writing, for instance, I mentioned my bassoon concerto. This is an instrument I not only don't know how you play it, I don't know why you would play it. I mean, it's like, who would do this? You know, but before I wrote my concerto, I felt like I had sort of become one with the instrument, so that if I opened my mouth, I was just convinced that a bassoon sound was going to come out of it. And I liked that feeling. Now, maybe, I think there's a difference, like I said before, in making a real challenge for a performer that not everybody can meet. And if they can't meet it, they don't like you. It's true. But if they can meet it and it makes them sound good, then that's a nice relationship. I've had very nice relationships with the orchestra. You know, the Philharmonic is everything they've done of mine has been really, really. I've felt lots coming back, and people giving, you know, more than the minimum, you know.
You came to New York to study with Ivan Guzelimian. Talk about that, and then we'll turn into your composition studies in just a minute. But talk about your work with Guzelimian as a violinist.
Well, I had gotten more and more interested in the literature, particularly the chamber literature of the violin, and I wanted to play it. And I had gotten to a point where I was either going to take the fiddle and break it over my knee in a million pieces, or I was going to play it better. And Guzelimian was, I thought, the guy that would. I mean, he had such a wonderful method of study and practice and all of that. I also had longed to come to New York for a variety of other reasons. I think it often amuses me in an odd sort of way when people talk about how so many of the artists' grants and things come to New York. Well, most of my friends were not born here. We all came here because it's a magnet. It was a magnet for composers and performers and people who wanted to test themselves against a higher level. So I'd always wanted to come to New York, and I just sort of pulled up stakes. In fact, I have one little picture of me as I played games getting on the train with my violin and I guess probably all my worldly possessions. And,
is the picture here?
No, it's too tiny. It's really too tiny.
Was Guzelimian a good teacher for you, the right teacher?
Oh yeah, it was just right for me. And I worked mostly with one of his assistants, but it was just what I needed, because I had never had really good schooling on the violin. I just sort of somehow played it, and I played better than I had any right to play, but I hadn't been really schooled. But I was still writing. I mean, but I was spending my time practicing for quite a while.
And while you were still writing, you came into contact with two huge figures in the music of our time, both of whom were your teachers, Roger Sessions and Elliott Carter. Talk about how you met them and came to work with them and what that was like.
It's funny, it just occurs to me it's almost the same thing as with the violin when I decided I'm just going to really try to make another step up. And the same thing happened with composition. I had written a fair number of pieces. I'd even had orchestral performances. Although I wrote a master's thesis for a symphonic band, because we had a wonderful symphonic band and a pretty good orchestra. I had won 3 prizes from the Florida Composers League, and I had, people told me they liked my pieces, and people were playing a couple of them. And so when I was in my late 20s, I was at that time also teaching as well as playing the fiddle here in New York. I decided to get a doctorate, and I figured I'm just going to put aside all of the existential questions like, does anybody want me to write music? And let's see if I can't do something and actually feel that I've written the piece I really wanted to write. And I went to Juilliard. I auditioned for Juilliard and got in. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. I worked mostly with Roger. I have an absolutely horrific picture of me with him. But it's such a... This is us in front of the Juilliard. And I think you were the one that said I was very brave to show this photo. But you see, this is so much this character. I loved Roger. He was a wonderful... Oh, I'm sorry.
Thanks.
And looking at this picture, the next thing is the smell of tobacco. Like he would put his hand in his pocket and it would come up, sort of brownish green.
You should show
Here's a
some
picture of Elliot and me, also in front of Juilliard.
You should show some of the photos you took.
These
as
are
well,
pictures
of the
I
two of
took,
them.
black and whites. This is... how do you want to work this?
That's just fine. No, what you're doing is just fine.
Okay, this is, I think, a nice picture of Roger.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm getting a little... Okay. Just a little... Okay, great.
Hope my hand is still.
Let's
You could put him on that music stand over there.
Here, this is good. Great.
The lighting isn't good, but I like this as a picture. And here he is. This picture was actually on a book cover. Here's another. He was a great man. I really loved him. And the peculiar thing is I never been able to say exactly what it is I got from him. Because he didn't have a system, didn't have any particular stylistic expectations. He was very laconic. He was not the kind of composition teacher who jumped in and said, "Oh, you can do this, you can do that," and if you do blah, 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 blah. He would sit there for. My first lesson was a total silence.
That must have been daunting.
Oh, it was very daunting. I was working on an orchestra piece, and my first lesson consisted of, is this a B flat or an A flat? I'd look at A flat. 4 more pages. Is that E flat clarinet or B flat clarinet? And he had the composure to wait until he felt he had something special to say about what he was looking at. And he waited a lesson and a half. Of course, I was a nervous wreck, but it was a wonderful, wonderful lesson, because at one point then he closed the score and he said, now I think I know what you're getting at, and let's talk about it. And he was like an older friend who stood by you. And I felt that while I was with him, I found who I was. And I don't know exactly how that was done, but it happened. And I don't think it happened in his presence, and I think because of him. Here are some pictures I took of Elliott Carter. These are all about the same vintage. These were about, like, I think I did this about 1980.
Okay.
This one I like. And Elliott, of course, is a richly interesting person. I worked with him only a short time, but we have stayed friends. Here's, I think, kind of a special picture of Elliott and Helen Carter.
Just one little.
This, of course, is in their house
Okay.
here in the city. Is that I realized that composers normally have, when the picture of you that's in the program, when everybody says you got to get a new photo, you go and have a new photo, and it's usually a posed sort of thing, and it doesn't look like you. Well, conductors have these wonderful pictures of them doing something, so I thought it'd be nice to make some pictures of
other composers.
Yeah. I did Kurtag also. I have nice pictures of Kurtag.
We should.
You do?
Yeah.
Oh, we should see those.
Yeah, we should see those.
From
It just
about-
would be nice to have
Yeah.
a picture in a program of Carter Sessions that says photo by Ellen Taaffe Zwilich.
Yeah. Well, this one's actually on a book,
Yeah, that's a wonderful one.
but I like that because there's a presence. And I was talking to them. You know, we were discussing music or something. So there's a sense of, it's not just a picture of pardon me, an old man.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a picture of a person with strength.
Animated.
Yeah. Well.
But I'm fascinated by.
I
I want to know more about Sessions because just from listening to you talk about him, it's very clear how important he was and is to you, and the fact that he must have been a very generous teacher.
Oh, yeah.
His own music is uniquely his and very different than any of his students. If there's such a thing as a school of sessions, it doesn't have to do with style.
it certainly it would be like I don't know what you'd have, but one of the most beautiful illustrations I've ever seen. A couple of years ago, they had a forum at Juilliard where Milton Babbitt and David Diamond both spoke. Milton and David are about the same vintage. They were both Roger Sessions students.
Well, there's a good range right
And
there.
you could see that these two men had absolutely nothing whatsoever in common. You wouldn't have to know their music to know that. Two totally different perspectives. Each one is outraged by something the other believes or thinks or writes. And I think that's an incredible mark in his favor. I think when you look at the list of his students, we're all over the map, but it's a rather long list of students who've accomplished something, you know, who've gotten some kind of recognition as composers, and it's remarkable. I think he was probably a little more doctrinaire in the early years than he was later. But he was a very unusual, very quiet presence that was an enabler in some way. I mean, he didn't praise you. I mean, his idea of praise was so far so good, you know. Mm-hmm. And, when he once told me I had written a striking piece, you know, that's like somebody else jumping up and down and saying this is the greatest masterpiece in the world. I mean, he was very quiet. He was a philosophical person. He was interested in literature and philosophy, and Carter also, of course, quite interested in poetry and the visual arts. And I think a great thing about both of them, these were cultured people, not just note pickers. You know, that there is a sense that what you're doing in some way is a cultural activity, that it is, on some level, it's an intellectual activity. It's an art in a sort of a higher sense. I had a wonderful time at Juilliard, I must say.
You talked about, up to that point, never quite feeling that you had the experience or the set of skills completely polished to have a piece that in which you stepped back and said, there, I've gotten it. What are the earliest of your pieces, or what was there a kind of
1971, I wrote a piece. I said, I did exactly what I wanted to do. I mean, this is a terrible thing to tell some young composers sometimes. It's just that there was like a hump to get over, to have a sense of, this is my voice, this is what I want to say right now. And even when as you change your mind and you evolve in a different direction, perhaps, you still look back and say, there's something sort of existentially valid. This is it. This is not just the best I could do at that moment, but this is me. This is what I want to say, and I said it.
What was the piece?
It's a piece I was telling you about, a song cycle I wrote for baritone and piano called Einsame Nacht. Mm-hmm. And I wrote that for the silliest of reasons. There was a wonderful voice teacher at Juilliard named Madame Freschel. And Madame had this theory that the Juilliard composers wrote operas before they'd written a scene, before they'd written a song, you know. And she accosted me in the hallway one day with a book of Hesse poetry and said, "Here, honey, go write a song." And she was not the person that you would say, "Excuse me," you'd say, "Okay, you know, thank you very much," you know. And I'm kind of an avid poetry reader. I always have been, and I almost never, ever find anything I want to set. I mean, I just like to read it. I don't want to mess with it. And I took these poems. It was a book with German on one side and very fine translations by James Wright on the other. And I took it home, and I thought, well, I'll humor the old lady. And I read through the thing. I thought, well, I'll turn down a leaf if there's something that I might be interested in. And at the end of it, I'd turn down about 15 leaves. I mean, it was amazing. Partly because the poetry is very open, and there's kind of, there's room. That's a very long, uninteresting story, but I ended up doing a whole cycle on it for baritone and piano. For how much longer did you go on actively being a violinist and the composer? Where was the point in which one began to pass the other, in this case composition? And was there a point in which, for a moment of realization, you finally said to yourself, you know, composition is what I need to do and want to do, and I'm a composer, and it needs now to take central place in my life? Yes, as a matter of fact, there was. When I was getting my doctorate at Juilliard, when I look back, I don't know how I did it, because I was teaching and playing. And one wonderful thing is that up to that point, I had been very fragile about working. I had to have total quiet. I had to have this. I had to have that. And I got to be able to work. I wrote a lot of music in the basement, sort of the Metropolitan Opera.
Where you were playing regularly?
Well, I played in the stage band, but my husband was in the orchestra, and I would turn off the squawk box. You still are going to get, you're not going to get Salome coming over the thing, but you get the slaves, please shut up, I can hear you on the stage, and whatever. But I was able to, I kind of also broke the hump of being fragile as a composer and being able to work in a lot of different circumstances. And but when I got my doctorate at Juilliard, I decided to see what I could do as a composer. And there was a moment that I will never forget where I had gone for a job, a university position. And I had liked the department chairman very much. I thought this is somebody I could work for easily, and we'd get along, and I understand him, he understands me. And I felt they were going to offer me this job. And I thought, and I thought, and I thought, and I decided to turn it down before they offered it to me. So I called him up. I said, I don't want you to offer this to me because I'm going to say no. And it's not because of you, it's because of me. That I really just want to give it a shot. And when I hung up that phone, I felt the most wonderful sense of relief. It was the most amazing thing. And then, of course, I had to confront, gee, you know, what am I going to be like? What's life going to be like at this point?
When was that?
1975. You know, a lot of people say, well, if I didn't have to do this, if I didn't have a job, I'd paint or I would do whatever. But to put it on the line, I wanted to do it psychically also. You know, it's like I don't want any excuses. I don't want anything. If my works aren't good works, it's not because they're not getting 100% of me. And it turned out to be the happiest decision I've ever made, and luckily, I'm looking for wood to knock on. Luckily, things worked out. I mean, it was quite an incredible gamble, but of course, I had the fiddle, and I sort of tapered off on that.
But that's an extraordinary decision. And one that not very many composers have had the courage to make. Even some of the best-known composers in America can fall back on the security of a university position and the salary, and in your mid-30s to make that decision. And, of course, you've now stuck to your guns completely for 25 years in terms of formal institutional affiliations. I remember when we met and first talked, it was in the early 80s and sometime or mid 80s, and
in Los Angeles.
In Los Angeles, and I remember negotiating just the practical arrangements if you're coming to hear Andre Previn conduct your celebration, to open his term as music director in Los Angeles. And you were very clear and very forthright that you made your living as a composer, and that coming and sitting and attending a performance was financially for you time away from doing your work as a composer, and that's very vivid, and rather have negative effect. It had very positive effect in thinking and in how one views what a composer does. So I'm still very much struck that at 35 you said, no, I'm not going to take a teaching job. No, I'm not going to be a permanent freelance violinist. I am going to be a composer.
Well, you know, it's one of those things, if it had turned out differently, you'd probably be kicking yourself. But I was happy.
It couldn't have turned out this way unless you had made that decision.
Yeah, and it's sort of like I just needed to either be knocked down and off my feet and not able to get back up, sort of, and then I would have settled down and done a normal thing, I think. I have to say that I was greatly helped by foundations at the beginning of all of this. When I got my Guggenheim, for instance, that was a very, very, very helpful thing.
And when was that?
But that wasn't until 1980. It's so funny. I mean, for me, composing is not just like a technical activity, although there are just so many things to think about, and I worry as much as anybody about the techniques of it all, and there's just so much to know. You just never quite know enough, which is, for me, it's a stimulus. It makes me want to. But at heart, for me, it's something very personal and important, and it's not what I do. It's sort of who I am, and that clarifies a lot of decisions that I make. For instance, I seldom hear performances of my music. My music gets played an awful lot that I never hear because I don't want to stop being a composer and run around and just listen.
In a panel the other day, when we were talking with your fellow composers, I was struck by the chronology of a couple of things. First, this question of when you made the decision in your head that I'm going to focus on being a composer, and so be it. That's what I am. And then, unrelated, I had asked the question about when each of you had sensed a moment of arrival in which you thought, hey, maybe I can make it as a composer, I can be a composer. And that significantly for you followed a year after you had made the decision to focus. What was that, point of arrival?
The ISCM, the World Music Days, which is the International Society for Contemporary Music, which is a wonderful old organization from the 20s, I think. Every year they have a World Music Days, and this was the first time it was going to be held in the States. It was held in Boston, and my string quartet, 1974, was selected for performance there. And it offered me an incredible opportunity. I mean, I knew it was going to be important, but I didn't even realize how important because of who was there. Not only did we have press from all over the world and that, but we had musicians from all over the world. And the things that, some things got talked about, and things led from that performance. Not so much from the fine reviews that my piece got, but from the fact that the musicians that were in the audience, like Richard Pittman from Boston Music Aviva. This almost leads in a very nice segue to the first Carnegie Hall performance that I had, because after I had this wonderful opportunity with the ISCM World Music Days, when they came to me and said, will you be on the board in New York? I couldn't very well say no. So I was on the board for a couple of years, and I had a few performances related to that. This was 79, where the League did my sonata in 3 movements for violin and piano. And there's a few things about this that are kind of... one is that the piece...
Can you take the tag off?
Sure.
Thanks.
That's the beauty of a Post-it. This piece was written for my husband, the violinist Joseph Zwilich, to play. And this is actually a program from the first performance, which was in Scotland. And there's a picture of Joe. And this was a program of the very first performance. This was written for him to play, and actually finished in a London taxi cab on a concert tour. And he died in 1979. He had actually been supposed to play on this concert at the ISCM. And at the last minute, they asked a young violinist whom I knew from Juilliard named Eugene Drucker to play. And Gene, of course, is a violinist in the Emerson String Quartet now.
It's amazing how things come full circle. Here's a concert 20 years ago in Carnegie Recital Hall, which is now, of course, Weill Recital Hall. You've now been the holder of the composer's chair for 4 years and the producer and presenter of contemporary music concerts in the hall where you had your first Carnegie performance.
Yeah.
So life has its wonderful, full,
Circles.
satisfying
Yeah.
circles.
Yeah.
Before we leave the subject, we shouldn't leave the subject of your violin sonata without talking about your husband, Joe, and your marriage. How you met and how he played a role in your life, if he did, in your activities as a composer. And then I know that his very sad and untimely death also had a kind of creative ramification in your work in the years after.
Well, actually, Joe and I actually met at the Carnegie Tavern, which was it was kind of like a German beer hall that was under where the musicians' rooms and the dressing rooms are now. And it was the kind of place that had beer and hot roast beef sandwiches, you know, that kind of thing. And everybody went there. All the musicians went there, from the highest level to the lowest. And I actually met him there after I had played a concert with the American Symphony, and he'd played the opera, and he came there. But actually, he tried to take me home, but I was with a date. And then someone fixed us up, and we hit it off. And Joe and I were married for 10 years. And, well, he was a wonderful friend, and that piece was a commission in the sense I was talking about the other day, where he said, if you write me a piece, I'll play it on my next European tour. So I wrote him a piece. He also conducted a piece of mine, and it was a nice musical collaboration as well as a personal relationship. He was kind of one of my first fans. As a matter of fact, Jane Drucker's father, who also played at the Met, came up to me. Apparently Joe was always saying, you know, my wife is a wonderful composer or something. Ernie, Jane's father, came up to me after they premiered my double quartet at the Chamber Music Society in '84. And he said, you know, Joe was right. But it was, it's something that's very hard for me to talk about. Everybody seems to have noticed a big change in my musical style, and I guess I do too, notice that. And it was that when Joe died, and he died at the Met as he and I were spectators at the Stuttgart ballet. And I was writing a piece for the Boston Musica Viva at the time, and this was a piece that had gotten commissioned because of the performance in the World Music Days in '76. And it was due, I think the concert was in November, and Joe died in June. And I just couldn't do anything for a very long time. And Otto Luning was very kind to me. He was someone who I had known from Juilliard also, and he called me up. He said, I see your name on the schedule. You're certainly going to go. I said, I don't know, Otto. He said, well, you make yourself go and go to this on Monday night and go to that and say hello to this person and that person. And I actually got myself there, and I functioned, except for having to bawl like a baby in the middle of the Mozart clarinet concerto with Boston Symphony. But when I went back the next year, it was so I had never been there. I didn't remember. You know, I must have been in a kind of state. Anyway, I couldn't write for quite a while. And then when I got back to writing, which I had to do to make this performance, I was such a different person, I had to start over. And I had very good advice from a composer friend of mine, Harold Schiffman, whom I have known since I was a teenager. And I said to Harold, I said, this has to be a memorial. And he said, don't. Just write the damn piece, get to the double bar, finish it, put it aside. It's too early. And it was wonderful, wonderful advice, because I didn't think, I just really did try to just finish the piece. And of course, it turned out to be a memorial. Mm-hmm. I think I came to grips at that point with not only how much music meant to me, and to be able to compose meant to me, but that it performed some function for me, that it's a way of me dealing with the world in some kind of way, and it got me very, very centered. And I think that any time you go through something like that, you either come out much stronger or much weaker. And one of the things that happens, or it happened to me and to others that I know that have been through something similar, and that is that there are so many things that people worry about, and what's the flavor of the month, and careers, and this and that, and you have a different set of priorities when you come out of this. You know, it's just kind of very clear. You look over all kinds of things and say, this is important, this is not. And some of the things that no longer seemed important to me, I followed very strongly at any rate, my music, my style opened up a great deal, I think.
Is that the work that they recorded?
The Chamber Symphony, yeah.
Well, that's significantly enough, that's the first piece of yours I knew.
Really?
Because of that recording. So it was a different kind of turning point, certainly not one that you would have planned in any way. But
no, it was, and writing for Boston Musica Viva was something very special, because now we've had a 20-year relationship, very close. And they were one of the first groups that did repeat performances. I don't know how many times they've played that piece, but they really have played it a lot. Then they commissioned a second piece. They commissioned Passages, which they've also played, whenever they could. And one gets so much from that. Well.
I look at the Carnegie Hall performance history, and it's had almost 20 consecutive years of performances. It was played by Michelle Makarski as both part of the Carnegie Hall American Music Competition and as part of her prize-winning recital. It was played just last year in the distinctive debut series by Robin Sharp and Jeremy Denk.
Yeah.
It still obviously retains its currency in repertoire.
Yeah, it's out there. It's been reprinted I don't know how many times. What I should say at this point, because this is an important historical fact, Carnegie Hall, with I think it was through the Rockefeller Foundation, sponsored a contest for, they never came up with a sexy title. It was always like the International American Competition for American Music or something. And my violin sonata got on the repertoire list. And that was an incredible shot in the arm for me as a composer, because when you look at the violin repertoire, instead of saying, a violinist saying, well, should I learn this new piece by somebody that I don't know, or should I learn the Brahms A major? I haven't played that yet. The chances are they're going to go with a repertoire that they might reasonably live with the next 40 years. But when they're choosing which American piece do I want to learn, that puts a whole new perspective on it. And I've found that not only for myself, but I think for John Corigliano and George Rockberg, any number of composers, this contest got these pieces just kicked them right into the mainstream. Mm-hmm. And there are even more performances, because I think the first year of the competition was '83, and two of the finalists played it that I know of, Gerardo Ribera and Richard Young. This was a very important function of Carnegie Hall in getting music out there. It's a shame that the competition stopped, because competitions are very bizarre. You can hold the perfect competition and not have the winner really get what you expected out of it. But sometimes these unintended consequences are very interesting. And I think this had a very positive effect on kicking some violin pieces into the repertoire, mm-hmm. and voice and piano.
Mm-hmm. Just sticking now with the chronology that we've been talking about, I noticed in Carnegie the Entrada was done by the da capo players a couple of times in the mid-'80s. Talk a little about that piece and the association with da capo chamber players.
Well, they're all friends of mine. As a matter of fact, Andrei Milyanov, the cellist, played in my Making Music concert. And they got a kind of a small commission from Chamber Music America and asked me if I'd write a piece. And I said, well, what do you need? And they said, more than anything, we need a short opener. And I said, boy, do you, because I had been to many contemporary chamber ensemble concerts where they started with my chamber symphony, and I thought, oh God, that's not the place for it. But then when I look at the program, I say, well, that's where I would put it too, because there was sort of nothing to go first. So I wrote a little piece that is intended as like a little overture of chamber music, and since I wrote it in Italy at Bellagio, I gave it an Italian title, Entrada.
And it's obviously a piece for which you retain affection, since you did include it in your Making Music concert.
It is what it is, and I'm trying to think. Probably my next important performance at Carnegie Hall after the violin sonata, and also string quartet was done here in the ISCM, and I think something else. In
'77, the New York String Quartet. April of '77.
The string quartet.
The first string quartet.
'74. Actually, it's not the first, because I have a zero. Actually, I have a 0 and a -1. I wrote one when I was in college, and I wrote another one when I was in high school, and I don't count any of them. But my first, we lost it. Well, this is recital hall. My first big hall performance was with the American Symphony under Kazuyoshi Akiyama in 1978. A piece called Symposium for Orchestra. This is a wild program, by the way. If you could hold that, I'll get a picture.
The Saint-Saëns Third Violin Concerto with Young-Guk Kim. And then the Bach-Schoenberg St. Anne Prelude and Fugue and the Firebird Suite. How did that performance come about?
Somebody, it might even have been me, got my music to Akiyama. This is a picture of him at that time. A fine Japanese conductor. we were musing at the time of this performance. We were about the same age of how our fathers could have killed each other, you know, in the war. And here we were close enough to be composer and performer. At any rate, another interesting connection is that the premiere performance of Symposium for Orchestra was conducted by Pierre Boulez.
Talk about that performance too. What was the?
That was at Juilliard in a festival, and it was with the Juilliard Orchestra in Tully Hall in '75, I think, January of '75.
Was that the first performance?
Oh yeah, the very first
Symposium?
performance, and the last until '78 was a very large orchestra, as the stage manager said to us. I had to go out and talk with him about some things, you know, and he said, "There's only one way out: go to the harps and make a right," you know. It was a wonderful performance, and it was a great thrill for me to have Boulez do my piece, and he brought a great deal to it, and it was quite a remarkable moment.
That had to have been another moment of arrival, because that was that same year as your ISCM concert or selection.
The year before, yeah.
75.
Yeah.
And I was just going to say, we've mostly been talking about small-scale pieces, but to have an orchestral piece done under those prestigious circumstances in your mid-30s is still a relatively unusual.
Particularly in those days when people were saying, you can't write for orchestra.
And this was a performance conducted by the then music director of the New York Philharmonic.
And conducted beautifully. I mean, it was really a wonderful performance. Mm-hmm. That piece is dedicated to Pierre.
So
with great affection.
There's a link. We should absolutely have a copy of that score in the archives, from one composer's chair to the other.
How are we doing with time and all that? We're doing pretty good.
We're doing well. I still have a ton of questions for you. So, let's sit and just talk about writing for orchestra, and if that's always been a part of your musical thinking. It would seem to me that sometimes for young composers that the practical investment in an orchestral piece when there is an imminent performance is huge. It's more time consuming. The physical labor of producing orchestra parts in an orchestral score is huge, and it's certainly easier to write a small chamber work for friends who you know are going to perform than think orchestrally with an uncertain future. But for you, even before your prominence and regular performances by orchestras, you were writing for orchestras and thinking for orchestras.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I mean, you could look at my life and say it's wise to do impractical things. When I had my Guggenheim in 1980, I was at the MacDowell colony for a couple of months. And I said to myself, here I am, I'm at the MacDowell colony, I've got a Guggenheim. What else to do but to start a big orchestra piece? Nobody wanted it. Nobody was asking for it. So I spent my 2 months at the MacDowell colony really hatching a large-scale piece for orchestra and kind of bringing to it a new way of thinking about orchestra for me. After I left the MacDowell colony, I had a commission from Boston Musica Viva, which turned out to be Passages, a work for voice and mixed ensemble based on poetry of A.R. Ammons. I had to leave this big orchestra piece and write Passages. And when I finished that, Francis Thorne of the American Composers Orchestra came to me and said, we have a kind of a small commission. Do you want to write a piece for orchestra? And I said, boy, do I. And it was a fairly close deadline. I don't remember what it was exactly, but I said, I sure do. And that turned out to be my first symphony, which turned out to win the Pulitzer Prize. And that really was very helpful in bringing my work to the orchestral community.
It is amazing, as with a couple of other turning points in your life, that the courage of your convictions at a critical moment led to something fairly enormous, in this case, an orchestral piece that really became your calling card to a wider musical world. And
as a matter of fact, you were in L.A. when Previn did that with the L.A. Philharmonic. Yeah. We go back to a few years.
And the 80s for you became a real decade of widespread recognition, particularly in the orchestral world. And suddenly, many of the major orchestras with many major conductors were doing your work. Talk about that experience and some of the things that stand out, not only the works, but collaborations with orchestras and conductors that stand out.
Well, it's been very remarkable, and a lot of people have done my first symphony. John Nelson made a wonderful recording. Gunther Schuller premiered it with the American Composers Orchestra, and John Nelson made a fine recording with Indianapolis. And there again, John and I have, as Gunther and I have remained close colleagues for these many years. John just did Prologue and Variations in Köln, I think, about a month ago, and continues to perform my music. I had a performance here with Hans Fonck in, I don't know,
97.
Something like that, of the First Symphony. It's been really quite wonderful for me to have been able to have a high, the high level of performance. And I've had wonderful luck with conductors really learning my music and doing extraordinarily well. I think winning the Pulitzer Prize for an orchestral piece was a great help in getting orchestras interested in commissioning. And my second symphony was commissioned by San Francisco. My third was commissioned by the New York Philharmonic. And I've done a series of concertos. I would have to say this has been a great experience for me. And they've been for Pittsburgh with Mazel, as I mentioned, and Chicago with both Schulte and Barenboim. In fact, I have a really kind of a nice picture here of, well, this is the American Composers Orchestra did the New York premiere at Carnegie Hall of my concerto for trombone and orchestra with Christian Lindbergh. Have you heard him play?
Yeah, he's an amazing.
He is truly amazing. This is about a 22-minute piece. He showed up at rehearsal. It's a hard piece. It's a real virtuoso trombone piece. He showed up at rehearsal without notes, and you could say, Dennis could say, start 5 before B, and he knew. That's how.
The degree to which he memorized.
He was a stunning player. He recorded it actually on BIS. But I don't have a picture from that, but I do have a picture from the premiere. And here's me in one of those little outfits I've found to wear. The principal trombone of the Chicago Symphony, Jay Friedman, the orchestra, and here's Sir George Schulte.
Looks like a very happy moment.
It was a lovely, lovely moment. And I must say, I don't, many of my colleagues have these horror stories about conductors and orchestras. I don't have any. I have really had very good experiences. And now Schulte, when he did this, I mean, this was 88 probably. He was in his 80s, and yet he had taken the time to really learn my piece and give it his best shot. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
While we're here, let's take a tour through some of these other Carnegie Hall performances.
Okay. Well, this was a world premiere at Carnegie Hall. Fantasy for Harpsichord. It was commissioned by the Concert Artists Guild, which is an organization that has kind of a contest for young performers and then sponsors them. Linda was a fine harpsichordist.
Linda Kobler.
Yeah, and I wrote a Fantasy for Harpsichord for her that was premiered here. As I recall, that was April 10th. It was the same night that Prologue and Variations was premiered with the Chattanooga Symphony, and I think I was there instead. There's a Murphy's Law about that. If you have only 8 performances a year, 2 of them are going to be on the same night. I've had, even when the Philharmonic premiered my 3rd symphony, Galway was playing my flute concerto in Phoenix, and Zdenek was doing Celebration at, I think, Minnesota, the very same night. You know, it's like unfair, but
that has to be another great moment of arrival for a composer, when you actually have to choose.
Oh yes, yes, it
between
really is.
Premieres or performances.
I remember when I was preparing my doctoral recital at Juilliard, the notion that there were rehearsals going on in the building, you know, in 4 or 5 different rooms of my pieces was about as exciting. I don't know, just there's something wonderful about that. Interestingly enough, Concert Artists Guild, their latest ensemble that they're supporting is the 8th Blackbird, who just appeared on our Focus on 4 concert. And a stunning ensemble.
Yeah, they're wonderful.
I think this is old. Yeah.
It's Milwaukee Symphony doing Celebration in '89.
With Zdenek, I've had about 200 performances of Celebration, and
that's astonishing.
Zdenek claims to be responsible for at least 25. That piece was written for John Nelson in Indianapolis to open the Circle Theater. And people, I mean, like you mentioned, Andre Previn used it in LA to open his tenure there. And it gets used a lot for celebratory events. This is something very special. This goes back to 80. This is a performance in the main hall at 87. And what's extremely special about this, if you can hold it, I'll get the other stuff. This was a joint commission from Carnegie Hall, the Detroit Symphony, and the American Symphony Orchestra League. And the way it worked is that the winner of the Carnegie Hall, whatever they were calling it, American Repertoire for Pianists competition, the pianist who won that award got to play the premiere, and it was with the Detroit Symphony, and it was at the ASOL convention, which that year was in Meadowbrook. I don't know where those, I have some of these pictures. Yeah. Oh, here it is. I left it in the score, naturally. This is the score. This was a Carnegie Hall co-commission in '86. And here's me at Meadowbrook. That's the Detroit Symphony in the background. This is my 2:45 picture. Because on the original, you can see the time, and it's 2:45. And here's a picture in the Carnegie, Cafe Carnegie, which is still here. And I wish I had, we couldn't find any pictures of Mark and Gunter. Marc-Andre Amblin, a wonderful young Canadian pianist, was the fellow who played the premiere. And he got to play at quite a few places, which was very nice. Let's see.
These look like they have nice photos attached to them.
Okay, this is my horn concerto. This was also premiered elsewhere, but the New York premiere was in the main hall. It was written for, Orpheus was one of the co-commissioners. It was written for David Jolly. And here's a program from the New York premiere of my concerto for horn and string orchestra.
And continuing all the things that come full circle, David Jolly just played in the Focus on 4 Making Music
That's right.
program this past Monday.
And here's a photo of Orpheus at about this time. As you could see, my concert was like 83, I think it was. We were all pretty young. And let's see what else we have here. Here's the Cleveland Orchestra commissioned my concerto for oboe and orchestra for the 25th anniversary of their wonderful John Mack. And they played the premiere, of course, in Cleveland with Christoph von Dohnanyi conducting. This is really circle within circle because he's the grandson of Arnaud Dohnanyi that I knew as a teenager. And he also has just very recently conducted my violin concerto in Paris with Pam Frank.
Oh, great.
Here's a picture of the Cleveland Orchestra at that time with Christoph. I better take this out if I can. Gina will kill me. No, I don't think I can. What a wonderful orchestra that is. And John is kind of like the dean of oboists.
Oh, he certainly is.
As it happens, Christoph hurt his back, and Leonard Sletkin
Took over.
conducted.
For just a few weeks ago, did the 2-piano concerto.
Yeah. And here is a picture just from that particular concert, I believe.
Oh, my.
When he conducted images for 2 pianos and orchestra here. I love that picture. That's
Yeah,
really
that's
so wonderful. Let's see. Here's the New Jersey Symphony. This is, it's the same as this. Here's Zdenek, who did Celebration here in, 87. He came here with the New Jersey Symphony and the Kalix-Stein-Laredo Robinson Trio for the New York premiere in the big hall of my triple concerto for piano, violin, cello, and orchestra. This is a picture of, I did a pre-concert lecture, and the KLRs joined me on stage for it. We go back at least 10 years further than that also, because I wrote my my piano trio for them. That also has had quite a number of performances. They've played it here in the big hall, and the Eroica plays it, and the Beaux-Arts play it, and lots of people play it. But that's been a wonderful relationship with this trio. I wrote the piano trio for them, I think it was in 86, and then the triple concerto in 96. And here's a picture of Zdenek and me in front of Carnegie Hall prior to the performance of the New Jersey Symphony of the Triple. Got it? We throw you a challenge every minute, right? Let's see.
Now this catches my eye, the Moscow
Virtuosi. Yes.
not known for playing a lot of American music.
Oh, they played a wonderful performance of Prologue and Variations. Kind of a small group, you know, and really marvelous. Spivakov is a fine musician. And let's see. This is Eroica, St. Louis. This is the National Symphony from
just a few weeks
just
ago.
a couple of weeks ago when with Katja Marielda Beck, they did Images for 2 pianos and orchestra. A piece, it was the only time I've ever done this, a piece that is based on paintings in the National Museum of Women in the Arts. I should have brought the insert with the pictures in it. Eroica Trio, St. Louis, New York Pops. Sketch did a piece of mine recently called Jubilation, within a Pops concert.
Just
Sorry.
That's okay.
This is.
Well, we'll get to making music.
I think.
Well, we've just been looking at an amazing round of performances at Carnegie Hall with a wide range of orchestras and chamber musics, and that's a very natural transition to the last 4 years in which you have really created and set the mold for the Carnegie Hall Composer's Chair. So we should spend very significant amount of time going into that association, which is now a rich part of Carnegie Hall's more recent history. How did it come about? How did you find out? How did it begin?
Well, it began, as many things in music in this town began, at the Russian Tea Room. Judy Aaron invited me to lunch. And I went to lunch, and she was there with Kristen Kaur. I figured that she wanted to get my ideas about something, and I've always been known as a friend to Carnegie Hall, and so I said, okay. And in the course of the lunch, she told me that they were thinking of creating a position for a composer. And in the course of the lunch, she asked me if I would be that composer. And unlike, you know that I turned down some very significant orchestral residencies. I suppose at this point I could say I never wanted to hurt anybody's feelings, but at Los Angeles Philharmonic, and Indianapolis, and the New York Philharmonic, and a few others, where even with conductors with whom I felt a rapport and you know, it would have meaning, I turned it down because I felt that it was too, it'd take too much away from my work. Although, you know, it's tempting in certain respects, but I just felt that it would not be right with the resolve that I had made. It wasn't right for me. It was right for everybody else, whatever, but it just didn't feel right for me. So I turned down things that just, I couldn't believe I was hearing myself say no. But one of the things you really have to do as a freelance person is learn how to say no. And I said no. But when Judy asked me, I said, well, let me think about it. And I told her of my interest in being a composer first. I told her of my unwillingness to go through people's scores, because I always feel, you know, like the person with a name you have never heard before on that pile. That's me. You know, I could not stand going through a pile of scores without doing it right. Mm-hmm. If you do it right, it's enormously time-consuming. The notion that I would be a composer first and last, and that within that there would be some projects that I could relate to, and that I would have a commission, 3 years of commissions. And that the first commission would probably be for a family concert. But I took it all in, and I had seen this wonderful hall in many different ups and downs over my years in New York. And I felt that Judy Aaron had done some really quite remarkable things to bring it together, and not just to dress it up and make it renovated and look better and be more comfortable for musicians backstage and all of that, but the kinds of projects were really meaningful, and I saw that it was an offer I couldn't refuse. I went back and I said, I'll do it. And so one of the things, they had started a conversation with music. So I came in with my idea, which was not just to talk about a piece, but, you know, on the theory that what Peter tells me about Paul tells me more about Peter than about Paul, that people would loosen up more. I mean, nobody's stiffer than me talking about my music. I've had to learn how to do it, but it's not something you do easily, and yet you can talk about other music much more easily. So I with the staff here, put together this series that we ended up calling Making Music, focusing on a single composer. We picked a doable number. We did 4 concerts a year, a single composer, and other works of that composer's choice. Now, I sort of put a thread through it. The first season, there was a major piece with a text. The second season, there was a string quartet on each concert. And this season, except for the last concert, each program had something from the vernacular. And it ranged from, you know, the things that people have come in with were just wonderful. We've heard, in addition to Steve Reich, we've heard medieval music on his concert. And Alvin Lucier, we heard, he brought in a gamelan from Wesleyan, and they played on his concert. Pauline Oliveros brought in a wonderful group called the Cultural Heritage Choir, which is really a chamber vocal group that does field hollers and all kinds of African influenced things. We've had some jazz, we've had some cabaret, we've had Beethoven, we've had Brahms, we've had
music from Milton Babbitt's Peter Pan.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's been. I have enjoyed it very much, and I've tried to put something together that, with this series, that treats the audience with respect. They're grown up. They can make up their own minds. They're not going to shove anything down their throats. But this is what there is, and you react to it in whatever way you do. But I think we've managed to create a nice feeling in the hall, particularly since Weil is a very beautiful room, and it lends itself to, especially since they got rid of that horrible proscenium that was there for so many years, and now it's kind of open. It looks like the living room you'd have if you could, and there's a kind of sense of connection to the stage. So these have been concerts of conversation and music with composers that I've chosen to represent not just a wide range, but people that are kind of the best at whatever kind of music that they do.
The range, though, which you mentioned, has amazed me. If one were just to take the 3 years of this series, has it been 3? Is that right?
3 years.
3 years of this series. You could have a fair understanding of the 20th century in American music just from the diversity of styles and diversity of choices they've made. And one of the dangers of composers' residencies, I suppose, is that it can be so closely a reflection of the resident composer's tastes that it can be relatively narrow. You haven't remotely fallen into that trap. You've been very generous with a stylistic spectrum that even within this season goes from Pauline Oliveros in one end to Milton Babbitt. Talk a little more about how you've came to select the composers across these seasons.
Well, I just remembered something Roger Sessions used to say. I think I'm the one who writes my music the best. I don't love a lot of music, but I tend to like a lot of it. The notion of imposing my taste is very foreign to me. I'm a real, like, American kid, you know. I mean, I grew up post World War II, and to me, it's when the Europeans say, well, things are out of control, I say, wow, that's wonderful, you know, because I like that idea. I like the idea that we're each very different. And I think that the thing that I look for more than anything is kind of an authenticity in a composer. A composer who's doing that, not because it's been decreed on high that this year such and such is in, but because that comes out of this composer's background and experience and loves of different kinds of music, and this is exactly what this composer should be doing. And that's kind of what I look for. And I suppose I didn't even think of it really in that way. I thought of putting an interesting series together. But I was very touched the other night at the last concert and we've had some subscribers that have been there thick and thin, who are not new music aficionados and not the normal people you see at a new music concert necessarily, but they've been there for everything. And several of them came up to me with big smiles on their face. They'd had a wonderful time, and so they also learned a lot. And I thought, isn't that lovely? That's nice that you know, we were able to bring them something kind of special. So I feel very good about that series, and I have found working with people here at Carnegie Hall utterly amazing, because with all the institutions I have had some kind of dealing with, I've never seen one that worked like this, you know, where you can count on everybody. They work hard, and if they say they'll do something, they actually do it. And so it was great fun putting all of this together with the staff.
One of the other valuable elements of the many valuable elements of the series is for your audience just to have that informal personal contact with the composers, which is something you've also, in representing your own music, have had to do. And as you talk to the young composers at the workshop, it was clear that they each need to cultivate that ability to make contact on behalf of their music. Can you talk about the composer personally as an advocate, first for your own music, but then as an advocate for others' music, a composer as spokesman or spokeswoman, if you will?
Yeah, I want to reel back a minute, because there's something else I want to say about the Making Music series, and that is that you're talking about performers and sort of an antagonism or this and that. For everybody, there are some people that just really get your music, and they love it. They want to come back to it. They're not doing it because somebody pays them to do it on Monday night. They're doing it because that's what they want to do. And that was another one of my real concerns with Making Music, that every concert have the best possible people for performing this composer's work. Not every composer's work, but who's the best performer for Steve? It would be a different one than for me. And I feel very happy that we were able to do that with the support of Carnegie Hall. We were able to aim for the sky and you know, come pretty close. About being an advocate, I think there are a couple of things. I think the general public has no idea what a composer does. I mean, they're very curious about us if they know that we exist. A lot of people think that the person who's conducting is the the composer somehow or other, or the performer. I mean, when you look at the whole pop thing, the notion of a composer is like a foreign idea. It's the performer's song. I think probably one of the major advantages of the composer speaking is reminding the audience that there's a mind that put this all together, and it looks pretty much like you and me. And this is a person who, you know, wore diapers at one point and has hobbies. And it was interesting to read in Peter Davies' article about Milton Babbitt that he hadn't realized how funny he was. And here's someone, Peter, who has a degree in music and has studied and all of this sort of thing. And just the notion that we're people too, and we can be funny, or we can be sour, or we can be this or that. And I think that's probably as important as what one says to an audience. That they are able to see you as a human being and not a metal or a marble bust. And the other thing is, I do think we have to be advocates. We're all teachers, particularly in the last 20 years, when you've seen the programs that normally would educate the young, you've seen them be just sort of ruined, which is another reason why I was very happy about the Carnegie Hall situation, because of the family concerts and the emphasis on education and the link up and going out to schools that's going on. That's important, and we have a role to play. It may be different from composer to composer, but we do have a role to play, and partly because we have a different perspective. Because when I came here, for instance, I knew the way things move in the concert world, that I wasn't going to be very visible the first year. So I rooted around in things, and one of the things I did was, I said, well, let's see if there's a performance history of Carnegie Hall. And sure enough, for the centennial in 1990, they had done a computer printout of world premieres and first performances. Well, I went through this thing, and the idea of the videotape came to me as I'm going through this, and I get to the 30s, get past the New World Symphony or the Tchaikovsky, all these incredible premieres that actually took place here, get into the 30s, and it was like, woo. First one I encountered, David Diamond. I know David Diamond. I've known him for a number of years. He's still very much with us. And these other names began to pop out. And I thought, let's use Carnegie as a sort of the stepstone to do some kind of videotapes with composers, to get them to talk, and to talk with another composer, which is very different, from there are various oral history projects, but it's a little different talking to someone who's a colleague. So I brought up this idea, and they jumped at it, and as you can see, it's a very elaborate. We have Nick. We have the sound. We have somebody spending staff time here writing things down. The archives have been gone through. It's a very major kind of production, but I think it's valuable, and it's something. It might not occur to someone who wasn't a composer, that here's this thing that's left, for posterity to do something with. And again, with the focus being Carnegie Hall, but it's been talking about music in the second half of the 20th century, and particularly what it's like to be an American working as a composer in this time.
You said at that first conversation that you made it clear that being a composer was your first duty and your last, and you've certainly been true to that. A major element of your association, most recent association, I should say, given all that we've looked at, has been a series of commissions. Can you talk us through each piece, what the genesis was in terms of the idea for the piece and how they've differed from each other, and then talk us through the first performances?
Sure. The first thing, as I said, was a family concert piece. And I had never written anything like this. But I thought it was such a good idea because, you know, all of us got hooked on music as children.
So that was specified by Judy, or from Carnegie, the idea of doing a piece for family concert?
I think we just all sort of agreed that's a good first place to do it. And something very bizarre had happened to me in 1990, and that is that I found myself in a Peanuts cartoon. I should have brought that one along. I didn't think of it, but actually I didn't have the pleasure or the heart attack of opening the paper and seeing it. I read the New York Times that day, and of course they don't have it. And I was out of town, and I called my machine, and it had stopped taking messages. And the first three were, oh my God, I've seen it. And finally, the fourth one was a very hip New York friend who said, in case you don't know it, you're in today's Peanuts cartoon. So I immediately did the dignified thing, which was to run to the garbage room and look for a Daily News or a Post. At any rate, the two of the little characters, Marcy and Peppermint Patty, were at a concert. And Peppermint Patty is kind of an unwilling concert goer. And she was sitting in her seat like this, and Marcy's reading the program, and she says, this next piece is a flute concerto by Ellen Zwilich, who just happens to be a woman. And the last frame, little Peppermint Patty is standing on her seat saying, good going, Ellen. So this was a rather shocking experience. And it occurred to me that maybe, you know, maybe we could do something with the Peanuts thing, you know. And I had written to Charles Schultz after this happened saying, you know, what do you say? I mean, thank you very much, you know. And he had sent me an original cartoon with a very lovely inscription about how he'd like to meet me sometime, you know. But anyway, I was a little shy about it. And so Judy wrote him a letter, asked him if he would be interested in collaborating with me. And he wrote back he'd love it. So what I decided to do was ended up being a piece called Peanuts Gallery. And the reason it's called Peanuts Gallery is that it's a portrait of Peanuts characters, a musical portrait. And of course, the first thing had to be Schroeder, because, well, everybody knows why. So the first movement is called Schroeder's Beethoven Fantasy. The second movement is Lullaby for Linus. Third movement is Snoopy Does the Samba. Fourth is Charlie Brown's Lament. Then Lucy Freaks Out. The last movement, Peppermint Patty and Marcy lead the parade. I had to bring them in since they were the ones that were so encouraging to me in my work. And I decided to do it for young pianists and orchestra. Although it was done here by a young Harvard student, Albert Kim, who was back playing this season. Jeffrey Kahane has done it, conducting from the keyboard. And they've got a jazz pianist for Chicago Symphony this coming up in a couple of weeks. At any rate, so I wrote this for Orpheus, and it was commissioned for them. And Charles Schultz did a nice little cartoon for each movement. I'll show you. You can see those later. Charlie Brown's Lament. Lucy freaks out. And then, this was premiered on a family concert right here at Carnegie Hall. I later made a solo piano thing of Lullaby for Linus. There's his little cartoon. And Snoopy does the samba. And this is a piece I would never, ever write down to children. It's a piece I like very much. I want the grown-ups to like it, but it's kind of simple, and the movements are short, and it works for young kids. Here's the program with a famous dog on the cover. And instead of a program note...
Can you start over on the cover? Thanks. Okay.
Instead of a program note, I wrote an open letter to the Peanuts gang, which can be read sort of between movements, if that works. And this was done here at Carnegie Hall. It's been done a lot since then, actually, I must say. And there's a wonderful gal named Judy Sladke who dances in a Snoopy suit. And it really is adorable. And after the piece finished, Snoopy poked his head out and came and got down on bended knee and asked the orchestra if they would play the Snoopy Does the Samba again so he could dance. And she does an incredible dance. I think I told you she's doing it in Chicago a few times, the Chicago Symphony. And here's a picture of, this is Charlotte Blake Aston, who is acted as a kind of narrator for the piece. Here's Charles Schultz, me, and this, of course, you know who that is. Here are some more pictures on the stage of Carnegie Hall at the premiere. These are Orpheus, and this is me and Schultz. He actually came to town quite a bit in advance, like the season before, and we went to the Kaplan Space, and I played what I had, and we talked about it. And this is my favorite picture. Judy Sladke, the Snoopy, is a great improviser. And when this cameraman got there, the dog went over to see. And Sparky Schultz did isn't that a cute name? Mm-hmm. That's what he likes. He did a cartoon about this. Did you get it? Isn't that cute? I love that Snoopy's listening here. Schroeder's playing my piece. Snoopy's listening. This appeared in 2,600 newspapers around the world, and I brought along a copy that a friend of mine who was in Taiwan on a medical convention, Marty Siegel's son-in-law, the China Post in Taiwan, and here was this cartoon about this piece in Carnegie Hall in English with Chinese underneath. And I've seen it in Belgian and in Flemish, and it's kind of amazing. So that was the first piece.
That was an auspicious beginning.
Yeah, and it was fun. It was really lovely time, and I think the kids had a good time. And
so that was
it's a piece that it's not a teaching piece about the orchestra or anything like that, but it is a portrayal of music, of characters in music, and they have very different characters. The odd thing, is here I am, like an old composer, and I'm sitting there thinking, now what kind of a dance would Snoopy do? And of course, I came up with samba.
So what was the next piece?
Well, the next commission was the violin concerto, written for Pam Frank. I do have a picture.
And again, the idea specifically of the violin concerto, was that yours, or were you asked for a violin concerto?
We talked about, what do you most want to do? What are the things that would work? We talked very early on about a string quartet, and we had to get the Emersons in the right season and all of that sort of thing. But a violin concerto was something really kind of bursting to come out of me. And I love Pam's playing. And the Orchestra of St. Luke's is quite a presence at Carnegie Hall, so that kind of made sense. Andre, of course, was in the premiere of Entrada.
Andre Emelianov.
Georgia Flizanis is the concertmaster of the Minnesota Orchestra, which premiered the Triple Concerto. And she was this associate concertmaster in San Francisco when they did my Second Symphony. And Paul Neubauer was in the Philharmonic when they did a piece I wrote called Cymbalon, which was premiered in Leningrad with Zubin Mehta and the New York Philharmonic. And of course it had a viola solo in it. Oh, this is a picture in Russia of Zubin and me and Rezhestvinsky, the conductor. That was in Leningrad in those days. Formerly St. Petersburg, once again St. Petersburg. And Paul, of course, is on the recording of my clarinet quintet. Mm-hmm. And it's...
Why don't we take the string quartet with us and sit and talk a little more about the violin concerto and then the string quartet. It strikes me as a little unusual, having written several other concertos, piano, trombone, flute, that you waited so long to write a violin concerto, having been a violinist more than anything else yourself, and in a sense not needing any consulting to write a violin concerto. Did you consciously put it off, or it was just a matter of never the right opportunity?
Well, the truth is I had started one for Joe many years ago, and I just tore it up. But I, in a way, I kind of wanted to wait, because when you play something, you don't want to write something that's based on the way you play. And I think I probably benefited from the distance, although I actually got calluses while I was working on it, because I still do a lot of improvising on the violin when I'm working. And of course I played through everything. I played through every note of all of my string parts in every piece. But I don't know, I think the violin concerto was something that was very much in me, that almost all of the reviews have said something about, one was a love song to the violin, another, it's a gift to the violin. It was very much from me to the fiddle. And then again, thinking about the continuity of it, one of the things that occurred to me, and I actually wrote it in a program note, Pam has this gorgeous Guarnerius from the time of Vivaldi. And it occurred to me that although you don't associate the violin with contemporary music, that in effect it's been playing new music since the 18th century. This very instrument. And that there's something in it that excites the imagination of people continually and from different times and in different ways. And it's just an amazing instrument. I played the violin because I adored the violin, not because I was given it in good schooling as a child. But I think it was very fortuitous that it was a later concerto rather than an earlier one.
And of course, the next big piece was also a string piece times 4. This time.
And while I didn't have a we only had slides of the Emerson Quartet, and my publisher had done a thing that appeared on the internet, but it comes out not clear enough. I found this picture from 1984. And this is the Emerson Quartet. That's Fred Sherry with black hair. There's another picture of the Emersons.
What was the occasion then?
This was at the premiere of my double quartet for strings, which was done by the Chamber Music Society, and the Emerson String Quartet was one of the quartets, and then there was a quartet from the Chamber Music Society. So here again, this is a relationship that's kind of gets refertilized.
14 years later, they get their own quartet.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? And here's this piece. This is the score of the String Quartet No. 2, and here's the concert program. Did you see that thing in USA Today? They made this.
It was proclaimed the
best new chamber music
best
piece
new chamber music piece of the
in '98,
previous year.
which is very nice.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to say they're playing it this summer in Aspen, Ravinia, and Tanglewood, which is awfully nice. Yeah. Awfully nice. This was a great labor of love for me because string instruments to me are kind of like the soul of music. And chamber music is probably, although I've spent so many years in the orchestral field and I love orchestral music, there's something about chamber music and the electricity of action from player to player. And I began this piece even with a kind of an image. So many of I've played a lot of the string quartet literature, and so many of the pieces of the literature are like a layer cake with the cello, the viola, second violin, first violin. And even when they break apart from that, they kind of eventually come back. And there have been some people who tried to create totally different repertoires, like a couple of Elliott's quartets, where they are almost in different universes playing. And I had a third concept, and that was like a galaxy, where you have these sort of figures that fly out like a planet would appear to, and get pulled back into the source, and that there's this kind of gravitational pull that they want to merge and they want to fly free. And they don't, when they merge, they don't end up in any particular order. So it's not quite like the standard repertoire, and it's not quite like, say, Elliott Carter's 4 different universes. It's like one universe, but people sort of flying freely. And of course, a lot of that had to do with the fact that both Gene and Phil Setzer, they both play first violin, and you have de facto no second violin. And one of the things I said to them, I said, don't tell me who's going to play first. I don't want to know. I want to write 2 first violin parts. And I don't want to have it set in my mind who's got the one that's marked number 1. I must say, this began as a 3-year relationship, and it became clear that we needed that additional year to really kind of wrap some things up, including the Young Composers Workshop, which is the concert we had last week. And that was also something that I felt, I haven't done anything at Carnegie Hall I didn't think was worth my time. And I do feel the music world has been extremely good to me. And this has been an opportunity for me to give back. And I have about 3 years of correspondence with various people here about what's the best thing we can do for young composers. There's a model, of course, the Isaac Stern Chamber Music Workshop is a wonderful thing. The choral, Robert Shaw and now Charles Dutoit workshops have been interesting. Boulez has done them, Barrio did one. But what I wanted to do was to try to step back and see what the needs of young composers are and how we could address them in a focused, intense way, and we certainly were intense. So we had a 3-day workshop that lasted from the 10th through the 12th of April of '99. And it began fittingly with a rehearsal and ended with a concert. Carnegie Hall generously commissioned 4 young composers who were the focus of the workshop, but any of the auditors, and we had about, I think, 36 from 16 different states, and many of them actually foreign, and they were just in school in a different state. Many of the issues that came up in the rehearsals and the, around the feature composers, I think were very, very instructive to the other young composers.
Explain the structure a little bit to how you went about it.
Well, I tried to pack as much into it as we could. In fact, there was one point where Judy said to me, well, how are you going to do all this? You have to work it out, how long is who going to spend doing this or that. And what I finally came up with, the whole first day was spent in rehearsal. And since we had 4 different ensembles, we didn't have to take breaks. So while they're resetting the stage, the performers and the composers got to talk, and we talked with the audience about what the problems are, what the issues are, what were the issues that came up in this rehearsal, and so on. I have to say, I back up a bit and say how we chose the featured young composers. As a ballpark idea, I said out of school and under 35, and instead of going the route of the anonymous committee, I picked 3 colleagues that I thought knew a lot of young composers and were quite different in themselves, and asked them each to recommend 2 or 3 young composers that they felt strongly enough about they'd be willing to stand up in Carnegie Hall and say at Weill Recital Hall, I think you should listen to this composer because. So I asked Milton Babbitt and Chris Rouse and Ollie Wilson to join me in this and to be like a faculty for this 3-day workshop as well. And they were delighted to do it, came up with some wonderful names. From this, we selected 3 composers. I added a 4th. And these were the composers that got the commissions and whose works were being rehearsed, discussed, and performed in the workshop. The first day of the workshop, we went, as I said, from rehearsal to rehearsal with the mentor composer and the young composer talking in between about the issues. And we had, in every case, we had very articulate performers who were able to say, this was a problem, this was wonderful, this worked, this, they were excellent and also instructive to the people who were listening. The second day, we began with a panel of publishers. We had Boozy and Hawks, all of the organizations that are aids and comfort to young composers, or old composers for that matter. And I went around this room with a handheld microphone, and I had emphasized to everyone that they had like 1 or 2 minutes to tell what their organization could do for composers. And then they have literature on this table. And the room was, after this short little introduction of the American Music Center, American Composers Alliance, American Composers Forum, ACO, the American Academy in Rome, the MacDowell Colony, the Copeland Foundation, the CRI, New World, I'm probably leaving something out, but mainly all of these organizations that serve composers in some way got to say what they did and give their literature to everybody who just roamed around and asked them questions and took things. later in the afternoon, we had a panel where the 4 senior composers talked about various things about life as a composer. One of the most important things to me as a former performer, I asked my editor at Presser to come in and do, he did an hour-and-a-half lecture demonstration on techniques for making good scores and parts, and particularly with the new computer technology, which is wonderful on the one hand, and on the other hand, it has lots of little problems that need to be overcome. At any rate, that I thought was very helpful to them. And the following day, we had the dress rehearsal of all the pieces and a kind of a dry run-through for the composers, the mentor, and the young composer to speak about the piece, followed by lunch at BMI, where Ralph Jackson told us about issues of rights and whatnot, and what BMI could do for young composers. And we had, that very night, we had a reception at ASCAP, where Fran Richards did the same thing. And in between, Ara moderated a panel with 4 mentor composers on the general topic of how do you define success as a composer, which is, I think it was a rather interesting discussion. And we ended our 3-day workshop with a concert, and I feel very happy about what we were able to give to the next generation of composers in this context, and the commitment of Carnegie Hall. And I hope this is a commitment that's always there to nurture the next generation, be they performers or composers, and to give us this space to grow in.
Another project that you've been involved in more recently also does that in a very different and unexpected way, which is the Millennium Piano Book, which is another underserved area. Talk about how that came about and the idea for that.
Well, the Millennium Piano Book is the notion of it was to approach about 10 composers who are not at all known for doing anything on other than a very high level of virtuosity, and ask them to write pieces that were of modest difficulty, without getting into what is modest difficulty. And we were free as composers to define our own term or ask whomever we trusted to tell us about this, with the notion that there's something important for a person who, let's say, is, one thinks of many adult pianists that we know, people on our own board, for instance, who play piano at a certain level, and how nice for them to be able to get into this. A few 20th century composers have done this. Of course, Bartók with the Mikrokosmos. Gyuri Kortag has done something very similar for pianists not on the highest level of virtuosity. And I signed right on to this project. I thought it was a very, very good, important project. And again, we tried to cross the musical spectrum, so we didn't get 10 pieces that were alike, but 10 highly individual pieces where you could feel the personality of the composer, but maybe the work is easier than normal. In my case, I wrote a piano piece that I can play, and if I can play it, you know, it's a modest difficulty.
Your association began with a lunch with Judy Aaron and Kristen, and you were always very closely associated with Judy, working directly with her. And of course, as we now record this in April 1999, it's been a few months since Judy's death in December 1998. For a future historian of Carnegie Hall who may be looking at this tape years from now, talk a little about Judy's place, specific to the composer's chair and to you personally.
Well, personally, I would have to say all of us who knew her reasonably well knew the struggle she had undergone for a number of years. As a matter of fact, the piece that I wrote for the Millennium Piano Book, I began when Kristen called me with the terrible news. And I wrote on it, and then I came back and put it together sometime later. And I tried to make it sort of become sort of upbeat, and I couldn't. It's too damn sad. It's a lament, and I just called it lament, and it's just. I think it's a terrible, terrible loss of somebody who fought very hard for life. But the thing that I think she will be remembered for is the turning Carnegie Hall towards life. And as I said, not just fixing up the auditorium and making it more attractive and making the backstage area more comfortable, but in really addressing the issues of the family concert, the educational outreach, the issues of the young performers, the distinctive debut series, the workshops addressing the problems of young performers of various kinds and now young composers. And of course, the notion that music is still being written, and we do have our lonely room that we retreat to write music. And that's a very important part of it, that kind of quiet downtime that I need to have as a composer. But you're in a climate, you're in a soil, you need the nurturing, you need the interaction with performers, you need to have the open arms of a place like Carnegie Hall saying, come, bring me your music. And the notion that when you step on the stage of Carnegie Hall, you have this sense of the ghosts of the past. I've always loved the image in the theater where you have the light that never goes out because of the ghosts of the actors that have been there. And when you think of who's been here and left behind something of their spirit, that's a wonderful, wonderful thing, and it's inspiring. But you have to take care of it's not enough to cut the flowers. You've got to plant the seeds. You've got to water them. You've got to nurture them. And I think that she will be remembered as somebody who set a new standard in a presenting institution like a concert hall, of trying to address not just maintaining the past, but creating the future.
Any closing thoughts? It's very fitting. I think we're ending as we began. We talked about a composer's progress from the privacy of an individual room and how quiet and individual that process is, and how it ends up in a concert hall. And your progress has ended up right within the walls of Carnegie Hall, where you're now a part of the history of this hall. Anything you'd like to add as we close this conversation?
I can't think of anything. It's just that I have, for me, it's a great privilege to be able to do what I do. I work very hard at it, and I'm always sort of striving for something. But it's a mystery, what music is, where it comes from, how this thing happens, where it comes to life. And I think that this is a place that celebrates that. And I'm just awfully happy that I have spent so many years of my life in Carnegie Hall, because it's kind of it's been a kind of musical home to me in many respects. And I may be leaving home, but I'm not estranged.
No, and you're
I'll always be a friend at Carnegie Hall.
Well, you'll always have a home, and you've in turn have made it a home for quite a few fellow composers, and now, even in this week, 4 young composers who probably never imagined that their creative path would bring them to Carnegie Hall. Ellen, thanks for your generosity in all you've done, and including your very generous amount of time this afternoon.
Well, thank you, Ira. And Nick.